Welcome aboard, wherever you are, whatever you're doing. We're going to be talking about raising the dead tonight, but it's not really what you think. Sorry to disappoint. We're not talking about conjuring up the souls of the dead or cadavers rising up out of the grave. We're actually going to talk about the ancient Egyptians and something called spiritual alchemy, a metaphorical raising of the dead, if you will. Ancient temple cultures such as the Egyptians recognized the body as a vessel in which the soul is trapped from its divinity. And although the person lives and breathes, their spirit is anesthetized, so their view of the world is narrowed to what can only be touched by the five senses, and such people thus were considered to be dead. So sit back and get ready to learn all about the ancient Egyptians and the art of raising the dead. Freddy Silva is one of the world's leading researchers of ancient systems of knowledge and the interaction between temples and consciousness. He's also a best-selling author and filmmaker. He lectures internationally with keynote presentations at the International Science and Consciousness Conference and the International Society for the Study of Subtle Energy and Energy Medicine, in addition to appearances on the History Channel, Discovery Channel, BBC, video documentaries, and radio shows. He's described by the CEO of Universal Light Expo as perhaps the best metaphysical speaker in the world right now. Freddy Silva, welcome to The Conspiracy Show. How are you, my friend?
Pretty good, Richard.
And we were just talking off the air. I was asking you, what it's like down there in Maine, where you reside, of course. Supposedly, I mean, you're in the path of Hurricane Sandy, and you say what? It's dead quiet.
Absolutely dead quiet. I mean, it's so still, you can't hear anything. It's the water. I mean, you can see reflections of the water. It's so beautiful. And, these things have a way of just manifesting off to the sea. So that would be nice, because I just armor-rolled the car.
God forbid anything should happen to the, yes. Isn't that always the way? You armor all, and then here comes a hurricane.
Yeah, I'm very proud of my Mini Cooper. It's a very small car.
I love the Mini. Gotta love the Mini. It is, of course, we're fast approaching Halloween, and I put the notice up on my webpage that we would be discussing the art of raising the dead, and of course that started the chats and the emails, and we're going to talk about zombies. No, not so fast. This is not about zombie worshippers. This is about the Egyptians and spiritual alchemy. And what they meant, we'll get into this, what they meant by raising the dead, but let's start with some definitions. Alchemy, we hear the word in alchemy, chemistry. Now, is there a relationship between the alchemy of the ancients and modern-day chemistry?
In a matter of speaking, I mean, what the Egyptians were always into was double entendres and metaphors. What you saw wasn't necessarily what you got. It was almost like the Christian ethos of Christ talking parables. And the ordinary people, basically, or the ones who were without, they said, they would hear parables and interesting stories, but the ones who were within, suggesting that they were part of some kind of a group who was, privy to something, the stories meant something else. And when you start looking at how all of these stories eventually end up in ancient Egypt, it seems that the Egyptians were doing exactly the same thing. You look at the origin of alchemy and where it all comes from, and you follow the trail through the Greeks who were studying in the library in Alexandria. And, essentially they borrowed everything from the Egyptians, and they gave them credit, of course. If you look at the origins of the name of Egypt, the Arabic name is Alchem, and that's where the origin of the word alchemy eventually comes from. So in a way, when you're studying alchemy, you're studying matter that comes from Egypt. And what the Egyptians originally were into in terms of the alchemy wasn't necessarily a nuts and bolts alchemy as we would know in the Middle Ages, where you turn metal into gold and that kind of thing. If you're looking at it from their perspective in the Egyptian culture, it was about a figurative transformation, and it was all to do with the ancient mysteries, where people who basically had the ability to learn the mysteries and what they called the knowledge, they would somehow be transformed by this knowledge into a sort of a self-empowerment, and they would slowly stop totally associating with their animal nature, and they would be transformed into gold. So the metaphor is quite obvious. It's nothing to do with the transfiguration of metals, but more to do with the transfiguration of the individual. So they basically come to shine as a star, they would say. People would basically go from associating with just ordinary objects, everyday life, material possessions, and they would be transfigured into light beings. Essentially, they would learn the alchemy of the gods, they called it. So it was really to do with the spiritual transfiguration of the individual while they were still alive.
They wanted people to wake up from this strange sleep that we continue to be in today, sort of stumbling through life, not really conscious or living in the moment. Is that basically it?
Oh, pretty much so. And if you look at a lot of the secrets that the Egyptians had, and they've carved a lot of this understanding on their walls of their temples. And even when the Templars were digging below the temples of Jerusalem, and they found the scrolls that the Essene culture had written, and also the Dead Sea Scrolls that they were found in Qumran in 1947, you look at all of these connections, and they seem to point to the same principle, that there was a certain group of people who knew something that was very special, to the point where it was always considered a sort of a secret club, and the only thing that they were hiding was information. They had some kind of information whereby the initiate or the candidate would be allowed into an inner group after a year of observation. In other words, they would keep an eye on you, and they'd make sure that you were someone who was reliable, trustworthy. So after you basically made sure that you proved yourself, then you'd be asked you'd be invited to join an inner group, whereby the parables were no longer parables. They would explain to you what these stories were, and that's how you started your, sometimes up to 10 years initiation into these deeper mysteries of what we would describe today as esoteric knowledge. And that's what basically separated the living, people who basically were totally alive and awake, from those that they described as the walking dead. Even the Egyptians recognized that the body that we have and we're born with is basically a vessel, and that vessel is essentially a carrier of a soul, and the soul is immortal. And for them, they recognized that once you're trapped in the body, that you are basically dead. They call them the walking dead. So that's where the comparison to the zombies comes in. But they basically were people who were just totally unaware. They seemed to think that life was basically getting up at morning, going to sleep at night, having your woman or your man, and toiling in the fields, and eating, drinking, and working, sometimes killing. And that was all. You just died and went back to the earth. But as far as they were concerned, they seemed to be tapping into something different. They seemed to have some kind of an antidote. And their antidote was to get you through this torturous process of initiation over the course of many years, to get you to understand and to see that you can have a deeper understanding of the mysteries of the universe, how the stars work, how nature functions. And after that, they took it a stage further, where they would take you into initiation chambers. Usually they were below the temples. There's still quite a those around in Egypt. And there you'd have a sort of a shamanic experience, whereby you'd sort of ingest a certain drug, and they would basically put you in this sarcophagus-type structure. And during the course of the night, after a bit of training, you would be able to guide your soul to go into all kinds of strange environments. And hopefully, by the time the morning sun rose, you would be awoken, and then you'd be guided out of the temple. You would greet the morning star, and you were said to be risen from the dead, because apparently you would come back with certain insights as to how the universe really works. And that's what gave them self-empowerment, to suddenly realize that they don't have to be beholden.
It sounds like they were being instructed on how to astral travel. Is that accurate?
Oh, that's pretty accurate, yes. I mean, it's just like some people describe having a shamanic journey in the jungle with ayahuasca. It's a very controlled way of allowing the soul to escape the body for a few hours. And if you're prepared how to undertake that journey, you don't just sort of disappear and go off with the fairies. You actually set yourself certain parameters before you go into this sort of deep sleep, whereby you do sort of a guided meditation. And because you are so focused on what it is you're asking of the spirit world, then hopefully you are trained to come back with specific answers to specific questions. And that was very useful, because you could solve all kinds of problems, and you could literally have a communication with, I would say, the spirit world.
Now, we hear so often about the Egyptian Book of the Dead. How does that book sort of go along with what these mystery schools were teaching, and or were they talking about the same thing in the ancient Book of the Dead, the Egyptian Book of the Dead?
Yeah, it was pretty much, the resurrection rituals were pretty much part of the Egyptian Book of the Dead. It's actually a mistranslation. The Egyptian Book of the Dead was sort of called that during the Victorian era, because the Victorians were obsessed with just looking at the very linear aspect of Egyptian culture. And for them, it was all about death, about embalming, so that's why they called it that. It's now been rewritten and renamed in light of new understanding as the Book of Coming Forth by Light. Now, that puts a completely different spin on it. Because when you're looking at it from their point of view, it means that you're actually being taught something in order to awaken to some kind of light, some kind of enlightenment. So it wasn't so much the physical death that the Egyptians were so concerned about, at least not originally anyway. I think eventually, like every major culture, they would eventually lose the plot, and then they would do things without really understanding what they were doing, just like we all do today. But originally, the Book of Coming Forth by Light was an instruction of how to actually experience the resurrection while you were still alive. And even the early Jerusalem church of the early Christian movement, which was a very Gnostic movement, which is all based on Egyptian principles, they too also understood that principle, that it was all to do about receiving resurrection while you are still alive.
All right, Freddie, hold on. We'll take a time out when we come back. I want to get further into these mystery schools and these illumined ones. I'm wondering whether this might be the source of the Freemasonry and the Illuminati and so forth. We have a certain perception of the Illuminati, but perhaps we were misguided. Freddy Silva will set us straight as we continue to discuss the legacy of Egypt, spiritual alchemy, and the art of raising the dead, right here on The Conspiracy Show. My name is Richard Serrett. We're back with Freddy Silva, the legacy of Egypt and the art of raising the dead. We're not talking zombies. We're talking about raising a consciousness and becoming an illumined one, I suppose, would be a fair way to describe it, Freddy. But there's that word, illumined, Illuminati. Are we talking about the same thing when we talk about this mystery school and what would later become the Bavarian Illuminists and the Illuminati? Is it the same origin?
Originally, yes. Yeah, it's just like Freemasonry. I mean, the origins of Freemasonry can now be very accurately traced back to the initiatory processes of a pharaoh. I believe he lived at about 1500 BC, called Second Henry Tao. And the authors of the hierarchy did some very good research on bringing that out, because they, as Freemasons, wanted to understand why they were doing these very unusual rituals, which no one seemed to explain why they did this. And it was the third degree of Freemasonry, where you are figuratively risen from the dead, from a grave, that suddenly started their whole ball rolling. And the same thing also happened to me when I was conducting the research for my current book on the Templars. I kept coming across all of these references to the initiates who kept talking about how I want to come into the joys of paradise. And I thought, what are they talking about? It seems so incongruous with the understanding of Templars, but once you sort of link the Templars as being the precursors to Freemasonry, because all of their systems of initiation were identical, then it was just a matter of finding out, well, where the Templars get this idea from about suddenly being indoctrinated into the joys of paradise. It seems to me that the people who were trying to join were experiencing some kind of illumination of some spiritual kind. And it pretty much was. Once you start looking at how the Masons also took their practices all the way back to this Egyptian pharaoh and what was happening in this guy's court, then it becomes very obvious that there was a system whereby the pharaoh would be spiritualized. He would undergo a ritualistic death, where he was basically indoctrinated into the mysteries. He would be put into a underground chamber or a sarcophagus, and then in the morning he would be risen, whereby he'd come totally to the total understanding of how everything works, and he would be shine as a bright star. And all of these processes are now found in the degrees of speculative Freemasonry, because just like the early Illuminati, there are different branches of Freemasonry, which some people use it for right action and some for not. And I have my own fair share of friends of mine who are Freemasons who will tell me that there are obviously certain branches of this very wonderful sect who do things in the very old tradition for very spiritual reasons. But then there are also those who, of course, use it for rather nefarious purposes. It's just energy. It's how you use the information, and the energy will direct the actual, send the direction into either right action or wrong action. So just like you have the Skull and Bone Society in Yale, who, of course, I think most of our listeners know all about that.
Yes,
they tend to use these things for very nefarious purposes.
Yeah, the initiation involves you're in a coffin. I think they lock you in a coffin, and I mean, we don't know everything that goes on in there, but some of it sounds rather nefarious. So you're saying that there is sort of a dark side to these mystery schools.
There is, because eventually it comes down to having an experience, and you have this incredible enlightening experience, and it can make you very drunk. I mean, I've been through the same process myself without even realizing what I was getting into. I've been learning the mysteries for years, slowly delving into it, experiencing it. I've had my experiences in the Great Pyramid too, without even requesting it or understanding that it was going to happen to me. And I can tell you, it can get to your head. I mean, you do get a sense of self-empowerment.
Can you tell me about that? What happened to you?
Well, it's a very interesting story. I work with a small group of people, one of many, many groups who go around the world fixing sacred sites. It's our charge to fix the things that people have messed up. It's like we're like the garbage keepers of the spiritual world. We pick up spiritual garbage. And we tend to go around the world quietly just tuning things up by a process of guided meditation, channeling of light, very old esoteric stuff. It all sounds very new age, but believe me, it's very, very important, and it is very profound once you've experienced it. And we were in Egypt on this particular occasion, and our group had not succeeded in getting direct access and private access to the Great Pyramid. There were some strange political undercurrents at the time. So I think 16 people of our group had to stay behind, and only 4 of us managed to get into the Great Pyramid. And there was the usual plethora of people running up and down the Grand Gallery. There was kids shouting, and of course the place is so perfectly fine-tuned that even the pin will, reverberate throughout the entire building. So it was very noisy. And we got up to the King's Chamber, and suddenly everybody vacated the entire building. You couldn't hear a thing, and we thought, well, let's seize on this opportunity and do the work that we've been told to do. And, we took some time for ourselves, focused. And at that moment, the lights went out, and we were in complete darkness inside this enormous building. And we felt, kind of calm about it, even though you're in the middle of this massive building full of blocks all around you. And we began to tone, which is the art of basically tuning into a certain environment, finding out a certain note that just resonates with the building. And we began to tune this. And as we began to get into the rhythm of it, in complete darkness, I opened my eyes, and I can see people coming out of the rocks of the actual chamber. And it was not unnerving in any way. I mean, I felt it was one of the first times in my life I actually experienced this sense of unconditional love. It was sort of a ring of people, very tall, very slender, dressed in the most beautiful white satin. And they just sort of surrounded us, and I just looked at them with my eyes open in total darkness, and I just kept toning and coming up with notes I've never been able to do before or since. And after about 15, 20 minutes, it was hard to tell how long it was going for, they seemed to just retreat back into the stones, and we took turns sitting inside the sarcophagus. And this is where it gets very strange.
Now it gets strange. Before you proceed, Freddie, I have to ask you this question, because you had mentioned earlier that in this initiation, as part of becoming an illumined one, there is some drug taking. Was there any ayahuasca or any sort of equivalent involved in your episode? I have to ask.
No, there wasn't. In fact, I find it actually, for me, it actually impedes the process. Even alcohol, I find it very hard to actually overindulge, because it really does stop your ability. And I think it's, and again, I'm talking from direct experience, where I was taught that the more you go to these sacred spaces around the world and temples, your body acts like blotting paper. You begin to soak up some of this energy. And if you're doing it correctly, it keeps building up your resistance to much finer frequencies. And I'm out at a point now where I can actually see energy lines flowing around the landscape. I don't even need dowsing equipment anymore. I can see this stuff.
Okay, I interrupted you there. So, you're in the King's Chamber. It's dark. It's quiet. These tall, slender, robed figures literally coming out of the rocks, surrounding you.
They surrounded us, and then they went back into the stones again.
Okay.
And we took turns going into lying in a sarcophagus for a few minutes because we figured we might push our luck. And I'm 6'5". The next guy with me is about 6 foot. Then we have a gentleman who's 5'6" and 5'2". So we're different heights. And after about 20 minutes, the lights come on. A very excited Arab gentleman is screaming downstairs. Obviously, we weren't supposed to be doing all of this without paying huge amounts of baksheesh. So we quietly went downstairs, gave him a little backhander, and then walked out completely dazed. Our group is in the bus waiting for us, trying to figure out what's been going on. And it's quite clear that 4 of us have had a very dramatic experience, and we weren't talking. And I could see the other guys wanted to talk, and I said, well, did you see what I saw? And the other guy says, those guys that just came straight out of the stones, dressed in white, very tall, and we were completing each other's sentences. Now, the chances of 4 grown-up men coming up with this by coincidence is very, very impossible. So clearly we had a shared experience. We all saw this. And the funniest thing is that when we talked about the experience in the sarcophagus, every one of them said, that sarcophagus fit me exactly like a glove. It was exactly my length of my body and my width. Now, how do 4 people of different sizes fit perfectly inside the same red granite box? That's what I want to know. And I can tell you to this day, Richard, that I don't know where I went in 5 minutes, but I'm still recalling all kinds of information. And in fact, I ended up writing a lot of it into my previous book, which is The Divine Blueprint. And that's where a lot of that knowledge came through. And basically that was what I was asking in the chamber. I said, I need to learn about this. I need to know how to use it. And how can I teach this to other people? And, of course, eventually it gets downloaded, and I just download it on paper. And there you go. So that's a pretty good example of just how it works.
It's fascinating. I don't need to tell you, obviously. I'm a Christian, Orthodox Christian, and there is obviously that part of this mystery school or this initiation that is sort of tainted with the occult brush. That this is the devil's work, and that. So, I mean, how do you? I don't know what your upbringing was in terms of religion, but let me ask it this way. We know that Jesus spent some time in Egypt as a child. Is there a connection that maybe Christians aren't aware of between what the ancient Egyptians were trying to do and what Jesus was trying to do?
Oh, it's huge. It's absolutely huge. And I was raised as a Catholic. I didn't have a choice. I was born in Portugal, and we either were Catholics or basically were devil worshippers. So I've actually come to, I hated Catholicism for a long time until I began to understand the origins of Christianity and how it preceded Jesus by a long, long way. And I began to take a huge interest in John the Baptist, who is, according to the Gnostic Gospels, the true Messiah, because there was 2 of them. There was the priestly Messiah and the kingly Messiah. And Jesus was supposed to take the part of the kingly Messiah, and John the Baptist's lineage was, of course, the priestly Messiah, and they had all the power. Now, we know that, of course, John gets his head chopped off, very unfortunate, and Jesus takes up the power. Now, this is where the Templars and the Essenes come into the picture, because when the scrolls were discovered under Temple Mount, and there's good evidence to suggest that the Templars did find the Essene scrolls, because they then undertook an obligation to reenact all of those mystery schools that the Essenes had been doing, and that was validated in the scrolls that were found in 1947 in Qumran. Clearly, the early Christian church in Jerusalem was also working on the Essene principle, because the Nazarites, or the Nazarenes, and the Essenes were essentially part and parcel of the same sect. So they were following some very old ritual traditions about raising the dead. And this is where the complication comes in with the Gnostic Gospels and the Orthodox Gospels, because the Catholic Church, as we know, and this is very documented, they basically heavily edited these Gospels. So they were trying to put forward a certain idea of how things work. They tried to turn Jesus into a god, whereby all the Gnostic people were saying, well, he was just an ordinary man who was fulfilling a certain mission to show how the mysteries are enacted in terms of saving yourself and your soul while you're still alive. Even the Quran states that Jesus was never died on the cross. It was a figurative death. And the Essenes claimed exactly the same thing in the Gnostic Gospels, that the whole idea of resurrection was a figurative resurrection. resurrection. You are going from the dead, and you're rising as a new soul while you're still alive, because you've come into the understanding of how things work. And in fact, there's a wonderful, there's two wonderful quotes from the Gnostic Gospel of Philip, which is now published, which actually ridicules, as they call them, ignorant Christians who take the resurrection literally. And he quoted it and he said, "Anyone who believes in resurrection as a literal truth is a fool." And only a few paragraphs later he says again, "Those who say they will die first and then rise are in error. They must receive the resurrection while they live."
All right, I got to take a time out. We'll come back and pick up on that most contentious point. Freddy Silva here on The Conspiracy Show. And we are back with Freddy Silva, the legacy of the ancient Egyptians and the art of raising the dead, spiritual alchemy. We were talking about the Jesus' missing years, I suppose, in Egypt. And Freddy, you and others believe, and I guess the Gnostics believe, that what Jesus went through this mystery school, learned this whole process, and this was the message that he was trying to deliver. I mean, without getting into obviously a sectarian battle here.
And that's the whole point, Richard, though. I mean, you go back to your original point about Catholicism and Orthodox Christianity. That's the whole point. And I believe it actually validates the Christian ethos of the fundamentals of Christianity as being a very honest faith. That the original Gnostic Christians totally understood that everything that was being said was figurative. It wasn't meant to be taken literally. And I think the Gospel of Philip actually illustrates that quite nicely.
But the Egyptians had a concept of an afterlife. They believed in an afterlife.
Oh, totally. Absolutely. And also when you actually get to the point where when you're in your deathbed, you should confess all your sins, you say what you regret, and you try to be honest with yourself so you don't carry this burden into your afterlife. But before that, that was a literal death at the end of your life. I mean, we all have to accept that. But before that, there were also the initiate schools which taught you how to actually live while you were still in the physical body. And that was the whole difference between the people who were the walking dead, as they call them, or the people who are actually enlightened, and the ones who had risen from the dead. And this was to be experienced while you were still alive. So clearly, there was some kind of indoctrination into working out how you could actually live your life as a soul in a body and be totally self-aware. And I believe that's where the spat came in with the later Orthodox Christianity and the original sects of like the Ascends and the Gnostic Christians and the Cathars and the Templars. And the thing that links them all, and why they were all exterminated by the Catholic Church, is that the one thread that links them all is that they all maintained that you had to basically find a way to become self-aware while you were still alive, and that gave you self-empowerment. And it didn't require a middleman, it didn't require a priest or a bishop to tell you how to communicate with God. Your communication was completely direct. And I believe, just by reading and taking without taking sides, just reading the evidence that's presented, I think that's a very good case. And in fact, it actually accentuates the ethos of Christianity. It actually gives me a good respect for it. I just believe that the way that it's been portrayed by the office of the Catholic Church is incorrect if you look back at the evidence that's portrayed throughout the centuries.
So what was the Egyptian viewpoint of the afterlife? There was, the soul is immortal. Where does it go? If you're good, where does it go? If you're bad, what happens?
Oh, they didn't judge either way. They just reckoned that you basically had to atone before you actually left. You didn't want to carry any weight into the other world. I think their understanding, if you just sort of, again, sit back and try to view it from their viewpoint, is that they didn't see right or wrong. They just basically said that you come into an imperfect world, a world that is very material, very heavy, and yet your soul is trapped in here. It doesn't understand what it's come here to do. So to try and learn some techniques that allows you to escape the gravity of the earth and escape your body for a few moments, even if it's just lucid dreaming, and if you can come back with some understanding that there's a bigger life out there, then you can actually use these tools to live your life with correct action. And you get it wrong. Sometimes you'll get it right. You have a whole lifetime to learn this. But the trick was that when you die, you confess all your sins and the things you got wrong. You declare the ones you got right, so that when you go into the afterlife, your soul isn't heavy. It's not sort of bogged down by things that you should have done, shouldn't have done, regrets and things. The idea was to have the experience and to understand the experience that separates right action from wrong action. There was not so much of a judgment from a creative God. It was more a personal decision to hold yourself accountable for your own actions. So in other words, you took total responsibility for being down here. And the difference was that some people were able to do it with better understanding and more clarity than others. And that's what separated the ones who are in the insight group as opposed to the ones who are just the walking dead.
We've got about a minute here before we step away again for a break. But what was waiting on the other side for the departed soul? Did they have a concept of heaven? Was it did they return to a singularity? What was it?
A lot of the inscriptions in the surviving the temples talk about the process of the soul becoming as a bright star, and so that you basically return to the world of the gods. I believe that it's sort of incomplete. I mean, we're sort of still picking up the pieces from centuries of neglect in the temples, so our picture is very fragmentary. But if you start adding the Egyptian understanding to, say, the Tamil culture of southern India, which is equally, if not even older than the Egyptian culture. I mean, they talk about temple cities that survived or didn't survive a major deluge, which is back in 9000 BC. And these things are going on to 15,000 BC, which are now under the ocean, and they've been found there.
Got to take a quick time out.